Yeah, there's something to that, but I think there's also the all too common phenomenon of people motivated by actually good intentions, even incredibly noble intentions, causing a lot of chaos that they didn't intend. Right. So I mean,
is that your model for what was going on?
Well, it's my model for part of it. So take someone like, we take Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, right? Well, I don't know Mark. I don't know how mercenary he's been from the beginning, and how out of touch with the possible harms he might cause he's been. But I can well imagine that here's somebody who could honestly say, connecting people is an intrinsic good. I'm just going to do that better than anybody, and the wealth will come, and this is all good for everybody, right? And then only at the 11th hour, long after many of us have noticed a problem, he begins to play catch up with the problem. That's a fairly charitable view of what he was up to. Or the Google guys, don't be evil. Like I don't think when they said don't be evil, they were twirling their mustaches and winking at each other, knowing all the while they were going to create a juggernaut of instability and also get fantastically wealthy and anchored to an extractive and ultimately unethical new kind of surveillance economy that we're going to be hard pressed to change. I don't think. At what point did they grade into having consciously bad intentions or intentions that were so mercenary as to be unethical? But a pure case of this, for me, falls in another sector, not economy, but foreign policy. You look at somebody like Samantha Power, right? Who wrote this famous book on genocide, A Problem from Hell. She drew lessons from our failure to intervene in a place like Rwanda, right? That we were morally culpable in some basic sense for not having intervened, right? We could have stopped the bloodshed. We didn't. And we even had, Navy SEAL teams. I mean, Jocko was just on this podcast. Jocko, I think, was offshore,
right.
At the time. We had drawn the lesson from Somalia, seeing our, the Black Hawk Down incident, seeing our soldiers dragged through the streets, that we just can't get involved. And what happens when you're the one superpower and you decide you can't get involved? Well, then people, butcher their neighbors, and there's no way to stop them. So I think with the best of intentions, she and many others drew the lesson that we really do have to be the world's cop on some level, and we have to get involved, and we're morally culpable for not stopping a rape in progress or a murder in progress. But now we're on the other side of that, U-shaped horror curve, where we now know what it's like to get involved with however mixed intentions, and it's a thankless job, right? Like nation building is not a job that we're going to want for a long time, and for good reason.
Well, I actually have some weird backstory on that one.
Uh-huh.
So I knew Samantha Power at the Kennedy School, and she and I sat down. I mean, not well. I think we sat down at a meal. We had friends that connected us. Right. And I asked, what are you interested in? And she said, well, I'm obsessed with the Red Sox and genocide.
Yeah.
I said, what?
That's a good icebreaker.
Yeah. And she said, well, the rap on me is I'm all genocide all the time, but nobody cares. And I've got this book, and I can't figure out the answer to the question, why is there not a resolution that why is never again not a resolution? And every time I try to get a state to sign up for this, or somebody to take this seriously, there's this weird wall that comes down. And it's the clearest thing in the world that we should never let genocide ever happen again.
Right.
And she was convinced that nobody was going to take her seriously. This was going to go nowhere. Mm. And then progressively, somehow, this thing started to catch fire. And for a period of time, I was emailing her, like, do you believe it now? Do you believe it now? Because I knew this thing was going to get huge. I also knew that it wasn't going to work, because it comes from this beautiful place that is not really deeply beautiful. I mean, it's sort of meretricious. It's appealing, but it doesn't understand what the forces are that create genocide, because very few people want to go that deep on that question. And in that case, I saw a human being who I can just vouch for. I mean, this was the purest of intentions early on. And then as the complexities started to reveal themselves, she became enmeshed in a very difficult series of trolley problems, or trolley-like problems.
Right.
I believe that partially happens in places like Facebook and Google, but very often, I think it's your theory of mind that I'm going to take issue with, which is that I don't think people are as unified in their thinking. They very often have a mercenary part of their brain and a beautiful part of their brain, and they have a partition that keeps those from talking to each other. And one of the ways in which I found this out was when a group of people, doctors actually, in New York City wanted to sort of use me as a consultant for my mathematical and analytic mind. And we went out for a very fancy dinner. And I said, what's the topic? And they said, reconceptualizing medical debt. I knew nothing about this. And essentially what they told me is that if you go to an emergency room and you agree to have all sorts of things done, you don't feel like paying exorbitant inflated bills later because you feel like that was an emergency. I had no ability to actually think this through.
Couldn't shop around, yeah.
Exactly. And this is extortionary. But if you give somebody the ability to say, okay, what if you pay us 82 cents on the dollar and we'll let 18 cents go, then suddenly the performance of that debt skyrockets. And a phrase came out, which was when they talked about reconceptualization, they said, it's a beautiful thing. And I realized that I had heard that phrase in New York whenever people are up to no good. It's a beautiful thing. Well, it's a beautiful thing. It's just, and so I then put out this thing in my group, which is, did you notice that when people in New York do bad things to other people, they always say it's a beautiful thing? And sure enough, it caught in people's minds. So whenever anybody started to say it, they realized, oh my gosh, I'm in a part of my mind that recognizes that I can transfer wealth from somebody else to me, largely without the other person knowing it, in a way that results in benefit for me and some harm that's been externalized. I think that people both know that they're doing tremendous harm and carry the idealism that propels it. And it's the combination of these things and the fact that they don't talk to each other.
Yeah, well, I think you're not going to get me to disagree there, that people are impressively split, or at least can be. And I think coherence, generally speaking, or at least striving for it, is good. I mean, I think living an examined life, in part, is struggling with those discoveries of incoherence and figuring out how to get this congress of minds that you call yourself to actually cohere.
But you're getting them to cohere.
Yeah, no. But when you're talking about the normal person, who I think it is a frequent phenomenon to have, normal the normal range of good intentions, to not be a sociopath, to want to help the world, to be in philanthropy, for instance, right? To actually be this. I mean, if you're devoting your life, if you're a smart person who got a good degree, who could work more or less anywhere, but you decide to work for a charity, right? You're already an outlier. You're already somebody who said no to Wall Street or no to Hollywood or no to something, and now you're working for the Southern Poverty Law Center or something. Like, you want to just stop racism, right? So you're already one of the good guys, right? And this is an example dear to my heart that I flog at every opportunity. The Southern Poverty Law Center is, I think, was probably consciously started for the best of intentions, operated under the blindingly brilliant light of those intentions for a very long time, but something flipped. And one thing that flipped is that, and it's probably unbeknownst to everybody, there's a bad incentive problem here. I mean, the only way they survive as an organization is to continue to stay in this sort of long emergency mode of there are Nazis everywhere, right? Everyone, it's like, this is a problem. It's a 4-alarm fire. Give us money. We now have a budget of whatever it is, $30 million a year. I mean, it's got to be huge. And the fundraising drive never stops. And so what happens to an organization like that when you begin to run out of Nazis? Well, then you have to find more, right? Like the incentive is to never recognize that you've gotten a handle on the problem, right? It'd be like, in some, epidemiological space where, you're curing smallpox, but you could never admit that you've actually cured it. You have to pretend to find smallpox everywhere. Now, I'm not saying white supremacy or white power or anything has been cured, but what has happened is you have people who probably were true outliers in their ethical scrupulosity who are now behaving in appalling ways, destroying people's reputations, calling them Nazis when they know they're not Nazis.
Well, let's put a finer point on it. They are now more likely to let the genie out of the bottle because of their bad behavior, or to, huff and puff on an ember that is the pathetic Ku Klux Klan of 2019,
right,
to actually create something that could turn into a roaring fire. I mean, this is a general feature. I often talk about this in terms of magnetic and true north, where the angle of declination that separates them is very small at the equator. Yeah. But in northern Canada, it's very large,
yeah,
right?
And at the pole, south is everywhere.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
right. And so it's just, the problem is that the institution. I mean, look, I've made this point elsewhere, so regular listeners will have heard it. But the concept of the embedded growth obligation, the ego of an institution, which is it has to do work and grow in order to meet its mandates. That is the thing that has metastasized throughout our institutional structure. And so it's not the Southern Poverty Law Center. I mean, that's particularly egregious, but the entire university system, every single measure you can take on that thing looks like an intergenerational wealth transfer, right down to the non-dischargeability of student debt and bankruptcy, the loading up of every university by administrators, and the monopolization at the moment. Almost 100% of our leading institutions are run by a baby boomer, whereas the average age in a different era of a university president would have most of them under Gen X control and some of them under millennial control. There were university presidents in their 30s who had a huge impact. I mean, that is a system which has gone totally metastatic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that may be an outlier. I mean, it's the way
it's the worst large system of its kind.
Yeah. I mean, the way costs have gone up there, way outpacing inflation.
Outpacing medical inflation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. And the fact that you can't discharge your debt in bankruptcy.
It's perfect.
Yeah. And the fact that, many of our friends have spent a lot of time complaining about this, but the fact that you have whole fields that are essentially, sham fields, right, that are in the humanities where it's just pseudo-knowledge is being imparted to the next generation. And it's not only its own walled garden of pseudo-knowledge, it is a disparagement of real knowledge. Like the anti-science, moral panic that is happening in the humanities.
It is a fit mimetic complex.
Well, it's fit thus far. I mean, it's producing new graduates. Yeah.
Well, and it's colonizing things outside of itself.
Well, yeah.
I mean, the problem,
tech, yeah.
Journalism, tech, human resources, anything which is a high leverage, but often poorly paid for the level of intelligence usually required, or the amount of training usually required, becomes attractive. So there's a perverse incentive when you can't pay journalists or scientists or even technologists at appropriate levels. And I know people will scream and say, oh, you have no idea how much money tech people get paid. And I really don't believe it. I think that those jobs are supposed to be even better compensated because of large scale tampering in the sector. What I believe is that we're looking at the difference between truth and fitness. And if you recall, when I first went on your program, I said I care about 4 things. Truth is one of them, but I also care about meaning, fitness, and grace. This is a great example where fitness is outcompeting truth.